Berlin. The summer of 1961 was drawing to a close. It had been a summer too hot, too dry, as if the sky itself was holding its breath for what was to come. For most, it was merely the quiet fading of warm days. But for Friedrich Keller, a simple factory worker from the East whose hands were etched with the grit of heavy machinery, it was the beginning of a never-ending winter in his soul. He was not a political man. The slogans emblazoned on the sides of buildings were just paint on stone to him. The flags that snapped in the wind were merely cloth. Ideologies were abstract concepts for men in important suits, deciding the fate of people like him in smoke-filled rooms. Friedrich's world was smaller, more tangible. It was the smell of machine oil on his hands, the taste of a meager supper, and the sound of his children's laughter. That was his only true ideology, to give his children a future where they could breathe freely, think freely, live freely. A future he could no longer see within the ever-tightening net of the system. Johannes, 7 years old, was the eldest, a quiet observer with his mother's thoughtful eyes, who asked questions that struck Friedrich in the heart. "Papa, why can't we go to the zoo in the other part of the city?" Emil, 6, was his pure opposite, a wild spirit with shining eyes and perpetually scraped knees, whose boundless energy was already beginning to rebound off society's invisible walls. And Clara, his little daughter, 3 years old, with a smile like spring itself, an innocent promise of a world that could still be whole. In the sleepless nights, when the breathing of his sleeping family was the only sound in the small two-room apartment, Friedrich made a decision that was bigger than himself, heavier than any steel beam he had ever lifted: to escape to the West. He spoke with his wife, Anneliese, in whispers, lest the thin walls betray their words. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the same desperate hope that burned in him. Together they planned, drawing maps on wrapping paper, saving every spare pfennig for the journey. Each day of waiting was a torment. Every encounter would uniform a stab of fear. Then came the night, a moonless night in late August. They left their apartment as if on a casual stroll, leaving behind everything that had made up a life. The photos on the wall, the toys in the corner, the familiar smells. With Anneliese and the 3 children, he crept through the sleeping suburbs and into the darkness of the woods that bordered the frontier. His heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the wind. Friedrich carried a sleeping Clara in his arms, her warm breath on his neck his only solace. Anneliese led the 2 boys by the hand, who bravely and silently tried to keep up with the adult's pace. Every cracking twig underfoot sounded like a betrayal, every cry of a night bird like an alarm. They were almost there. They could already glimpse the lights of the west through the trees, a distant, unreal glow that promised freedom. But then, suddenly, the wail of sirens tore the silence apart. Beams from searchlights danced like malevolent ghosts through the woods. The barking of dogs, aggressive and close. And then gunshots that ripped through bone and marrow. Panic, pure animal panic. Friedrich saw a gap in the fence, a weak point. He pushed Anneliese and the boys through it. "Run!" he yelled, a command that tore his throat. "Run, Anneliese, don't stop." He lifted Clara over the wire, pressing her into his wife's arms. One last look at their faces, distorted by tears and terror. In that instant, he made a second decision. He turned and ran in the opposite direction, shouting, to draw the attention to himself, to buy his family the crucial seconds they needed. He stumbled, fell, scrambled back up. He was the decoy, and they took the bait. The Soviet border guards seized him, their grips like iron vices. They beat him, not out of necessity, but out of rage for those who had escaped. They dragged him away. For days that stretched into weeks, no one knew where he was. He vanished into a system of interrogations, darkness, and pain. They wanted names, routes, helpers. But Friedrich had nothing to say. His only thought was a silent prayer. Let them have made it. And when he was finally released, gaunt, with empty eyes, he was a different man. Not broken, but cloven in two. One part of him was now in the West, in his wife, in his children, in the life that had been ripped away from him. He was a body left behind in the East, while his soul had fled across the border. He was not allowed to follow. No letters, no visits, no explanation. He was a political case, a traitor branded and isolated. The wall, being erected in those days from concrete and barbed wire, was only the visible symbol of the wall inside his heart. Friedrich settled in a small, forgotten village near the border, a place with no special features, gray and unremarkable, except for a hill at the edge of the fields. From this hill, on clear, windy days, you could just make out the glow of West Berlin on the horizon, a distant shimmer, a promise that for him was a wound. He went there every day. After his shift at a local foundry that filled his lungs with dust, he would climb the hill. He would sit there for hours, motionless, moving only his eyes, searching for a sign, a shadow, a sound. He spoke to them in his mind, telling Clara about the birds in the sky, asking Johannes if he was studying hard in school, and warning Emil not to get into trouble. He bought an old radio with a long, sensitive wire for an antenna. It became his only friend, his only link to the other world. He listened to the Western stations, news about a political world that no longer interested him, radio plays that carried him away for a moment, and children's programs. He listened as children sang, laughed, and told stories. Every bright young boy's voice could be Johannes. Every loud laugh could be Emil's. Music, he welcomed it all, in the desperate hope of hearing a familiar voice. Perhaps Johannes would be interviewed somewhere as a young scientist. Or Emil, who might have made a name for himself as a musician. Or Clara, who might just call into a show and say the word Papa across the ether. Through the invisible, through relentless time, the years passed, slow and viscous like hardened resin. The hair at his temples turned gray, then white. The shoulders that were once straight and strong now stooped under an invisible weight. The hands that had been strong enough to fix an oven or plant an apple tree now trembled as he broke his bread. He spoke little. The villagers had grown accustomed to the strange man on the hill. They left him alone. If someone did happen to ask if he had a family, he would answer in a toneless voice, "I had one," a sentence that contained an entire lifetime of loss. In 1984, during a particularly cold winter, he collapsed. He was found in the deep snow on his hill, his face turned towards a distant glow, his heart weak, his bones brittle. He was taken to a nursing home, a small room, pale, weak light, a bed, a closet, a chair, and a window that faced east. The irony hurt more than any scar the border guards had left on his back. But Friedrich didn't complain. He had forgotten how. He asked for only one thing, a working radio. And so he sat day after day, night after night, by his bed with headphones on, listening to the voices from far away. When the nurse came in the morning, he would often find him awake, his eyes open, as if he had been waiting all night for a voice that never came. Then 1989, the wind changed. A storm of change swept through the country. The wall fell. The images on the television showed people dancing on the wall, hugging each other in tears, popping champagne bottles. Freedom, reunification. For many, it was a political miracle, a triumph of history. For Friedrich, in his quiet room, it was hope, a tiny, trembling flame in the darkness. But it was also fear, a paralyzing fear. Nearly 3 decades had passed. What if they didn't know him anymore? What if they had forgotten? Anneliese, had she remarried? Did his children call another man Papa? He was old, weak, a ghost from a past they had surely left behind. Had they buried him in their hearts in order to move on? The thought was so painful, he turned off the radio. The silence was suddenly more bearable than the jubilation of others. One evening, weeks after the wall had fallen, the telephone rang at the nurse's station. The young nurse, who knew Friedrich's story, ran into his room, his face flushed with excitement. Mr. Keller on the phone. It's your children. They found you. They're coming. Friedrich didn't smile. He didn't cry. He only took a deep breath, an inhalation that held 28 years of dust and silence. He laid his trembling hands flat on the thin blanket. He stared at the door, and he waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Every footstep in the hallway, every sound, was a form of torture. And then footsteps. 3 sets. They stopped outside his door. The door opened slowly. There they stood, Johannes, a man in his late 30s, tall, dignified, with the same thoughtful eyes, now clouded with shaky, uncertain gaze. Emil, powerful, broad-shouldered, with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. And between them, Clara, a grown woman, but with the same smile he had last seen in a sandbox, a smile that fell like a sunbeam into the dreary room. They stood still as if frozen. For seconds, no one spoke. Time itself stood still, suspended in that one impossible moment. Then, Clara fell to her knees beside his bed. She took his gnarled, folded hand in both of her warm ones. Her touch was like a bridge across an abyss of time and pain. "Papa," she whispered, and the word was an entire universe. He turned his head slowly, as if the movement required infinite strength. His gaze wandered from one face to the next. "Is it really you?" he asked, his voice a hoarse, brittle sound. Emil nodded, unable to speak. Johannes stepped closer, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. And then, as if on an invisible cue, all three of them embraced him. Shaking, sobbing, silently, they held the frail body that had once been their protector, giving back the warmth he had yearned for 3 decades. And Friedrich, who had lived for nearly 30 years in an internal prison of longing and silence, closed his eyes. The winter in his soul finally gave way to a gentle, final thaw. "Now!" he breathed, barely audible. "Now I can go. Now I am home." His last breath was not a sigh of exhaustion. It was a prayer that had, at long last, been answered. Friedrich Keller never became famous. His name is not in any history books. There is no monument to him in any of Berlin's grand squares. But for 3 people, for Johannes, Emil, and Clara, he was a symbol of love that outlasted walls of both concrete and time. And somewhere on a small, windswept hill near the former border, from which you can see the lights of Berlin on the horizon, there stands a simple wooden bench. Affixed to it is a small brass plaque. Engraved upon it are just 4 words. "I always saw you.